Hi everybody, and welcome to English 2238 Contemporary Fiction. This is our Friday news post. Don't forget that this week your paper on the book of your choice is due by 11:59. I'm taping this on Wednesday night. I have about 10 more critical response papers to the things they carry to read, so I'm guessing by the time you watch this, Turnitin will be open. I'm aiming for noon on Friday, but I'll write that in D2L. I wanted to say one thing about the critical response papers. First of all, I've seen an improvement in some students, especially from the first paper, so that's really terrific. But a portion of the class isn't really responding or interpreting, but presenting the story, rewriting the facts, just telling us what happened, instead of analyzing or finding something new. So I'm thinking of an example from the things they carried. Here's the one that comes to mind. Your paper could say that, oh, I know somebody did this. This is a good paper. I can't remember, I think it was Joshua, good paper, who said one of the things we take away from the things they carried is that truth doesn't matter. The real concrete truth. Did O'Brien shoot this person, or did somebody else, or what happened in the muck? What happened in the Buddhist temple? The real truth, like if you had a camera, that doesn't matter, and that's not what the book is trying to show, but the book is trying to show the emotional truth. The book is trying to show a larger truth, a philosophical, a moral truth about war. So the details of the real truth don't matter in this book, and they're not O'Brien's intention, and he even says this himself. So I think the thesis statement was something like, truth as we know it isn't what O'Brien is aiming for. It's not true, but O'Brien consciously is looking to tell us some larger truth, a moral or philosophical truth, and that's an interpretation. But to just write, this and this happens isn't an interpretation. Before you start writing your paper, you need to have the main point that you want to show. You're reading along, and you notice a pattern, or you notice a theme. And that theme or pattern that you notice, or the way the words work, something you see, that's what your paper is about. So some papers need a much more original idea. So, and watch the amount of quotations that you have in the paper. Turnitin tells me what percentage of a paper is made up of quotes. So if your paper has 50% quotes, that's only 50% of your own words. That might be a little too much. So just, have enough quotes to prove your point, but use your own words to make your point. So that's what I wanted to say about the papers. And I did also just want to say something about the fickle nature of literary fiction. I can't remember who wanted to read Jodi Picoult. I think I'm saying that right. And I said, no, she's the epitome of commercial fiction. And I didn't mean that to be disdainful. I haven't read her books, but I've heard her on the radio. She sounds great. And I love many commercial fiction. John Grisham, what am I thinking of? Oh, the Sarah Paretsky, the V.I. Warshawski books, those are amazing if you like mysteries. Sarah Paretsky, wonderful. But that's commercial fiction. Literary fiction has a quality to it, attention to language, to aesthetic, to the beauty of the language, or to that larger moral philosophic point that O'Brien tried to convey in the things they carried. If that book had just been kind of a voyeuristic representation, reproduction of the atrocities of war, we still wouldn't be reading it, because the next reproduction, the next, shoot 'em up movie book would have happened. But instead, O'Brien tapped into this larger universal truth, and it's beautifully written, and these things elevate the book to literature, to being literary fiction. So that's the difference. Commercial fiction is fun, a lot of it has a message, but the language and the sophistication of the book, both at the level of language and the larger message, just don't rise to the standards of literature. They're just not as strong. Now, part of the problem with what I just said is that who determines that standard of what's strong? So, for example, women writers, I'm thinking of the women poets of China in, when was this? Early, I can't remember what era this was, the Ming Dynasty, but women were writing poems. Women produced a huge amount of work, but women's work wasn't valued. Women, in some cases, weren't allowed to write in many parts of the world, didn't know how to write. So they never would have met that gold standard of what constitutes literature because they didn't have access to it. Even so, that gold standard of what constitutes literature in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of American women were writing poetry, fiction, and their work was categorized as women's literature. It wasn't literature, and it didn't meet the gold standard. So that gold standard of what literature is, that has also something to do with politics, economics, education, privilege, really. And so who has access to that privilege is also who's going to be counted in literature. It was possible to you could take a class, you could have taken contemporary literature in the 1970s and had only white men, because only their work was considered as part of that standard. And only through the social changes of the 60s and 70s, and then something called identity politics in the 80s, when more different kinds of identities were recognized in academia. So only with those changes did women and people of color emerge as even being considered to be in those standards. So some of the writers that we treasure today might never have been considered. I'm thinking of, gosh, I can't remember the name. There's a really, I can't remember who wrote it, but I'm thinking of slave narratives, because there were some stories written by escaped slaves about their travels and how they escaped, during and before the Civil War. And we're only now looking at these as literature, for the universal moral bar that they reach to, the language, the beauty. But that writing never would have had access to literature before. So even though I'm urging you to, I urged you to, and for your writer profile, you're going to want to pick some writer whose work is literary, I'm suspicious of that standard also, about who gets in and who gets out, because it is arbitrary, it's human, it's subjective. So if you have somebody that you want to make a case for with the writer profile, you sure can. But I just wanted to acknowledge that that line is so ambiguous. So I think that's it for today. And my camera made a little beep, so I'm afraid it's going to turn off. But the book Thorpe that I mentioned was a good example of that. Thorpe, I wrote about it on Wednesday, is really, really a brilliant, gripping, wonderful book. But it never got noticed, and why? And I do think that this was an unconnected woman in the 1960s who just didn't have access to privilege. But it's interesting how many wonderful writers are out there now whose work will never be part of contemporary fiction, of literature, because they don't have access, now that writing is so commercial and so much of it is a business. So it's very subjective, this line of what gets published and then what we call literature. So that's it for Friday. Have a good weekend, everybody.